Alright guys, welcome back to another episode on Rancor Exotics. Hitting you up with a second video this week. And this is going to be a care video on a bird's eye view care of a viper gecko. Carrot tail gecko, or, let me check my Latin, Teratolopus fasciata, or it got renamed to Hemidactylus imbricatus. That's what they're called nowadays. Now, what are viper geckos? Viper geckos come from the exotic lands of the Middle East. Unlike the Bronia, which I covered last time in this series, this species is not all endangered. They breed very quickly. They are prolific breeders. They're not endangered. They're on the least concern on the endangerment scale. So absolutely wonderful. Now these are tiny, sassy Pakistani geckos. They're extremely hardy. They're long-lived, and they're absolutely beautiful. They have a lattice type patterning on their back. Though there are normorphs for this species, their default colors, people are gonna roll their eyes when I say this, but their natural colors are absolutely crazy cool. Now, if there are morphs associated with it, that'd be a cherry on top, but who can complain when you got such a nice looking gecko to start off, right? Now these guys are kept much like leopard geckos, but they do have one little quirk to them. Now these guys do climb sheer surfaces. People say they only climb them when they're younger, when they're young juveniles or young babies. I have a couple of decent sized viper geckos. They're not a year old yet, so you can still say they're juvenile, but they climb glass. They can climb sheer glass. So you're going to want to top with these guys or something to make sure that they don't get out. These guys are pretty small, and one of the best things about them is that they're communal. We can get into a little bit about that later on. So for an enclosure, you want a viper gecko. What do you need? To start it off, we really don't need bioactive. They come from very arid areas, so you don't need to worry about misting them too much. I would say a simple enclosure. You can have a paper towel. You can have non-compactable sands. Of course, I really wouldn't suggest you use sand. I would say to use paper towel while they're younger, and then maybe move them on to something like biossoil later on, or coconut core that can get compacted down so they don't have to have a mouthful of their substrate each time they eat. But people do keep them on sand, and they can do fine with it if you take proper precautions. Now, for their humidity, they like it around 40 to 50% humidity, which is perfect. That means they really don't need that much humidity. Probably in your area, throughout the world, this is perfect. This is probably your local humidity, so you don't have to worry about it too much. Not like the Abronia that needed constant attention to the humidity. Now, their hot spots, they like it hot around 95 degrees, 92. They like it hot. They do come from the Middle Eastern countries, so keep a nice toasty hot spot for them. Their ambient temperatures, they range from 75 to 85, which is not hard to do as long as you keep a good hot spot. These geckos will probably thermoregulate just fine. Of course, what else in their enclosure that they'll probably like are pieces of driftwood and other pieces of wood that they can kind of squeeze themselves into. I've seen people use stone for that. I think that that's a little too risky for me. I'd rather have pieces of wood that interlock securely that these geckos can wedge themselves into, because I'm paranoid and I don't want to crush my tiny gecko. Now, the thing I've used that I found that they absolutely love is cholla wood, which is basically a dried cactus. It's hollow in the middle, so they can climb in and they can feel secure. They can get out at any time. It's perfect. Each time I poke my head into their enclosure, I always see that they're always in it, so I know they absolutely they do enjoy it. Now for lighting, lighting for these guys is fairly simple. These guys are nocturnal, so you don't need UVB. As always, it's always nice to offer UVB as an option. Options are never bad right? You yourself probably like having several options when you go out, right? So offering them UVB will probably help them in the long run, but is not needed. I personally don't offer UVB. However, I do offer other things to supplement that, like D3, for example. Now, overall, very hardy species, very identical in care to leopard geckos. However, they do climb glass, so please have a secure top, and they're fairly small. If you do decide to buy hatchlings, they are very, very tiny. They can probably lay down on a quarter just fine. So make sure that your enclosure is escape proof. Now for the husbandry, the diet, they like anything insect that can fit in their mouths. When they're younger, this is probably the highest hurdle for this species, is that when they're hatchlings, they do need to be offered fruit flies daily or small insects daily, like fruit flies. I've seen people feed them bean beetles, very small insects on a daily basis. Since they're so small and they get pretty large relatively fairly quickly, I also highly suggest gut loading and putting powders on these feeders, simply because there's not a lot of diversity in the feeder since they're going to be so small, the geckos that is. Now that's the diet. Insects, very small insects. You can feed crickets and mealworms. Superworms I think are going to be a little too big. You can feed Kelsey worms and all that stuff. Anything that's small, an insect small enough for them to eat, fair game. The more variety, the better. And that's when they get older. Now for another thing is misting. These guys really don't need misting as long as you keep a shallow water bowl. They do like, I mist my geckos about 3 times a week. My setup is not bioactive at all, so I do have to get in there and clean out the feces. Unlike leopard geckos that go almost exclusively in one spot, these guys don't care. They poop anywhere, which is, a bit of a bother, but oh well. Now I mess around 3 times a week. This is just to make sure that the geckos take in some humidity. Sometimes they just don't want to go for a drink, and I just want to make sure that they're properly hydrated and they don't dry out. Supplements, again, since they go from a extremely small hatchling to a 5-inch gecko, I do believe that proper amount of calcium is needed. Of course, to breeding females in a colony, you should have calcium available to them in a small dish, besides their dustings of feeders. I do feed calcium and moderate amounts of D3 when I powder my insects. So make sure that you do offer those things as well. Handling. This is a species that does not take handling too well, simply because they're too small. This is probably one of the reasons why the viper geckos have lagged behind the leopard geckos in popularity, and that is because these guys are so small. I would not feel comfortable holding these guys. Only time I actually do pick them up and interact with them is when I'm pulling them out of the tank to clean up their enclosure, and that's basically it. So these guys you don't really interact with very much. For cohabitation, this is probably the biggest up of this species. You know, if you buy a leopard gecko, you buy a crested gecko, they demand a lot of space and you can only have one. Well, this is a small species and you can cohabitate them fairly easily. Now there's a lot of back and forth on the internet whether or not males should be kept together. I go by Josh's Frog's guidelines and care sheets. Josh's Frog is probably one of the more reliable breeders, I believe, and that's where I sourced half of the viper geckos that I have. I sourced half of the others from other breeders. So this way I wouldn't have all one bloodline of geckos interbreeding with each other. That'd be horrible. Now, the male to male ratio, I believe, is what is important. If you have too many males in your colony and you don't know about it, they will probably end up fighting, butting heads, and creating territories in your enclosure. So if you only have one male and 3 females, I don't think there should be any worry about cohabitation. It's only when you have, say, 3 males to 1 female that there probably will be a fight. So keep an eye on the gender ratios. Josh's Frog says that males can be kept together. I've kept an eye on all of my geckos. I keep a weight record on all of them. You can't really tell them apart. However, I do keep weights on all of the geckos. If one ever lags behind too much, I've separated them, but that's never been the case. All of my geckos have pretty much gained weight at the same rate, so that means all of them are eating, so that probably means that all of them are not stressed. That's what I'm inferring. So I think cohabitation isn't probably an issue. Just keep an eye on the gender ratios. So if you're one female and your group of guys doesn't get singled out and get stressed. Now, breeding, these guys are pretty prolific. They lay around 2 eggs one every month, right around. You might say that's not a lot. Well, over the course of a year, you'll have 24 eggs from a single female, and that's a lot of eggs. So what you want to make sure is that your females are getting the proper amount of calcium. They're not getting overly stressed. They're not losing weight too fast. Even though they're very small, I do suggest getting a scale to make sure that they're not losing weight too quickly and their appetites are on point. Because you can have a colony of these guys in the same tank, you'll probably have more than 1 female. So that means you're probably going to end up having several clutches of eggs every month. So that means you're going to get a lot of viper geckos fairly quickly. Now you might think, oh, these guys are gonna be breeding like cockroaches. You know, you can look online and they're going for, you know, $150 a pop. I'll make my money back. These guys, to get started, will probably take 2.5 years. And since they breed so much, the prices can be driven down fairly easily. I've seen them being offered fairly frequently, so don't think you're going to be selling out of these guys the moment they come out. This is a very beautiful small gecko, and I don't think breeding should be the focus of you getting these guys, because, you know, these guys are just freaking rad. So again, let's get into availability. They're not commonly found in pet stores, even though I've said they breed so much. They're not found frequently in pet stores. They're at some expos. I've run into them once before. However, they were hatchlings. I don't recommend buying hatchlings. I recommend buying something a little more established, because hatchlings do tend to suffer from failure of thriving. They won't eat and they'll crash and probably die. That's how it goes for these little geckos. Online, you can find them fairly frequently. I've seen them on Morph Market. I've seen them on Fauna Classifieds. Josh's Frogs, which is an online vendor and breeder, they commonly have these guys. So online, they're fairly common. These guys are not imported at all, thankfully, because these guys breed so well in captivity and so breed so well in the wild. These guys are not threatened at all, so they're not imported almost at all. And though, of course, if you measure it of inch to gecko to the price, they're pretty expensive. Like I said, they go from $50 to $100 a pop. You might thinking, oh, that's not too bad. However, you end up with a 1/4 inch gecko, and that, you think that's a lot of money for such a little thing. However, they're not overly expensive for a beautiful pet. I think that overall, in the grand scheme of things you can buy to your collection, that viper geckos are pretty inexpensive. Their setup is not that expensive, not like an Abronia's Enclosure. Viper geckos, I think, are perfectly middle ground. Now, these guys do have a couple cons. In viper geckos, stay small. Leopard geckos get fairly large. You can handle them fairly well. They get around 8 or 9 inches. These guys get at most 5 to 6 inches. These guys are small geckos, and as they grow, they're small to barely handleable when they're an adult. So you got to make sure that if you're gonna get this species, this is not a species to hold. If you pull them out every day or every other day to handle like a leopard gecko, these guys might get hurt. They're pretty small. Now, when they're hatchlings, they're pretty delicate. I've heard that if you offer them food every day, the hatchlings tend to do better, more tend to thrive. But overall, they're just still very tiny. I mean, you can keep probably 5 or 6 of these baby hatchlings in a shoebox, and it will feel like a mansion to them. They're very small. Again, the host of issues with such small geckos come into play. They can get lost fairly easily. They can get hurt. So make sure that if you are going to breed them, or you're going to buy hatchlings for whatever reason, to make sure that you are ready for such a small gecko. Now, another con is that you're going to need a steady supply of small feeders. You're probably going to end up having to make your own fruit fly colonies. Now, you won't have these fruit fly colonies will probably last for as long as these guys are small enough. I found myself replacing fruit flies with extremely small crickets once they got large enough. And of course, I have 6 geckos in my enclosure, so I know that every single cricket I put into there is going to be hunted down and eaten. So leftover crickets won't be an issue. Now, that's the thing. Make sure you have a proper source of small prey items. I don't know where you are in the world. Maybe you're in an area where it's extremely hard to get fruit flies, or you're just in an area that doesn't allow them. You need small species, bean beetles, something. Please start up a colony before you get these small geckos. That way you have a good food source available right off the bat. And this is especially true if you're going for hatchlings. Now, the enclosure size might be a bit of an issue. Like I said before, they're small, so they don't need a large enclosure size. However, let's say you buy 5 viper geckos, right? And you put them in an enclosure that's big enough for 5 viper geckos. However, 4 of the 5 are males, like I've said before. That enclosure you got might not be big enough for 4 adult male viper geckos. Since they're gonna bash their heads against each other, I'm not sure how much friction there's gonna be. You want enough space for this ratio of males to have enough space to get away from each other, to have enough lines of sight obscured so they don't go after each other. And at that point, I believe that you should have another tank set up for the another tank set up for these guys, because you shouldn't have too many males in a colony to begin with. That's my opinion, and that's what I believe should be done in that scenario. Maybe you have your own colony of viper geckos and they're all males, like a big frat house, and they don't fight at all. However, just to be on the safe side of things, I would personally separate males into other enclosures. Okay, so for closing statements, viper geckos are very beautiful, absolutely delightful. They're extremely sassy. The small amount of the small colony I have are extremely sassy, man, and they're so personable. These guys are like velociraptors. When you put food into their enclosures, I have crickets, I powder them up, throw them in there. They come out of the woodwork like Alien versus Predator. The aliens just come out of the vents. These guys are crazy. They will eat in front of you. It's absolutely wonderful. Small geckos, powerful predatory behavior. They're awesome. They run down their food. It's great. So all of this offered in a tiny gecko package, not overly expensive to buy, not overly expensive to set up. Of course, the biggest con is having small prey items like fruit flies. However, I think that's a fairly cheap compromise to make. Alright, so that's been the viper gecko or the carrot tail gecko. If you have any more questions, please post them down in the comments. Please feel free to cross-reference anything I've said. If I've said anything incorrect, let me know. Let everybody else know. If you have any other tips or any other insight in this species, put it down in the comments. And thank you for coming by and hearing me talk. Have a good one.